The number moved quietly through Harlem before the sun went down. $50,000. Not spoken loudly, not written anywhere, but understood by the men who needed to understand it. In the late 1950s, that kind of money wasn't just a reward. It was a signal. Someone powerful had finally decided that Bumpy Johnson's time was worth pricing. Harlem felt it long before anyone confirmed it. Conversations shortened. Eyes lingered. Familiar smiles didn't quite reach where they used to. The neighborhood had lived under pressure for years, but this was different. This wasn't squeezing. This was a decision. Bumpy Johnson knew the rhythm of Harlem better than anyone. He could feel when the air shifted. That night, as he stepped into a smoke-filled club he had entered 1,000 times before, nothing looked wrong, yet everything felt unsettled. Jazz drifted through the room, glasses clinked, laughter surfaced and faded, but beneath it all ran a tight, nervous current. He took his seat like always, calm, unrushed. To anyone watching from a distance, he looked untouched by rumor. But the men closest to him felt the weight of the moment. They knew what a contract meant. They also knew that when a contract went active, survival usually depended on movement. Disappearing, striking first, creating chaos. Bumpy did none of that. He didn't change his routine. He didn't clear the room. He didn't surround himself with noise and muscle. Instead, he waited. Not because he didn't believe the danger, but because he understood it. The Mafia believed money could solve the problem Harlem had become. $50,000 was calculated, enough to tempt, enough to motivate, enough to turn someone who mattered. The people who approved it believed the hardest part was already done. Once a price was set, the rest usually followed. What they misunderstood was the man they were dealing with. Bumpy had survived too long to panic now. He had watched men run from death only to meet it in darker corners. He had seen quick reactions end in loud funerals. Stillness, when chosen carefully, was its own form of control. Around him, people sensed something they couldn't name. No one said the word assassination. No one needed to. The unease filled the gaps between sentences. Even the music seemed restrained, as if it knew to leave space. Bumpy sat with his back straight, his presence anchor in the room. He listened more than he spoke. He observed who avoided his eyes and who lingered too long. This was not fear. It was attention. Outside, Harlem moved as it always did. Streetlights buzzed, cabs rolled by, life continued. But somewhere within that movement a line had been crossed. A life had been priced. And everyone who understood the game knew that once that happened, there was no such thing as coincidence anymore. What unsettled people most was not the contract itself. It was Bumpy's response to it, or lack of one. A man who had built his reputation on survival was choosing to remain visible, present, still. The question began to circulate quietly, passed from table to table, from glance to glance. How did he know it was real? And if he did know, why was he still sitting there? Bumpy lifted his glass and took a slow sip. The calm was not ignorance, it was intention. Somewhere ahead of this moment, a plan was already forming. The night was not about escape. It was about allowing something inevitable to reveal itself. While others waited for violence to announce itself, Bumpy waited for truth. And in that waiting, the balance of the city was already beginning to shift. Nothing about this night would end loudly, but everything about it would change forever for Harlem itself. Harlem, in the middle of the 20th century, was not a place built for comfort. It was built for endurance. Families lived week to week, sometimes day to day, relying on informal systems to survive when formal ones failed them. Money moved through the numbers, slips, and backroom deals because banks had long stopped being an option. Small businesses survived on thin margins, always one bad week away from closing their doors for good. Italian interests understood this vulnerability. To them, Harlem looked like opportunity waiting to be harvested. They circled constantly, not with open war but with pressure. Higher cuts, outside operators, quiet intimidation. Each squeeze was designed to fracture the neighborhood slowly, to turn survival into desperation. Bumpy Johnson stood in the center of that pressure like a brace holding up a weakening wall. His role was never flashy. He didn't need headlines or spectacle. What he provided was stability. When disputes threatened to spill into violence, they ended at his table instead. When businesses were pushed too hard, the pressure eased. When outsiders tried to take more than their share, they were reminded where the line was. That balance kept Harlem intact. People trusted him not because he was feared, but because he was consistent. He understood that chaos benefited no one who lived there. Every conflict he absorbed was one less that reached the street. Every quiet correction preserved the fragile order that allowed families to keep going. The Mafia never respected this kind of power. Their model depended on dominance, not maintenance. Territory was something to be drained until it broke. Harlem refused to break because Bumpy refused to let it. As long as he lived, expansion stalled. Profits stayed local. Control never fully shifted. To outside powers, this was unacceptable. Harlem was supposed to fold under pressure. Instead, it adapted. What made Bumpy dangerous wasn't violence. It was the way his presence alone altered behavior. Operators thought twice before pushing. Politicians hesitated before interfering. Even law enforcement learned where pressure created more problems than it solved. He had built influence without announcing it. For Italian leadership, this created a deeper concern. Harlem wasn't just resisting control. It was proving that order could exist without them. That example threatened more than revenue. It threatened the structure they relied on everywhere else. They tried negotiation. It stalled. They tried indirect force. It backfired. Every attempt to undermine him only strengthened his position. Loyalty deepened. The neighborhood closed ranks. That was when Bumpy stopped being viewed as a local boss and started being seen as an obstacle. An obstacle is different from an enemy. Enemies can be fought. Obstacles have to be removed. As long as he stood there, Harlem remained untouchable. Not hostile, untouchable. This realization changed the tone of conversations behind closed doors. The problem was no longer about money. It was about control. And control, once challenged, demanded resolution. Bumpy understood this long before they acted on it. He had built his influence knowing it would eventually provoke escalation. That was the price of stability. Protect something long enough, and someone will try to take it from you. Harlem never broke because it wasn't left to fend for itself. Order threatened outside power because it removed leverage. Control mattered more than money because money could be earned elsewhere. Authority could not. By the time the pressure shifted from influence to elimination, the decision had already been framed. Removing Bumpy was no longer optional. It was necessary. What they didn't understand yet was that necessity does not guarantee success. especially when the man you are trying to remove has spent his life anticipating exactly this moment. As financial pressure quietly transformed into plans for assassination, Harlem continued its daily rhythm. But beneath that rhythm, a deeper tension formed. The neighborhood was about to learn how far its protector was willing to go to preserve balance. And the Mafia was about to learn that removing an obstacle was never as simple as they believed. The meetings were quiet, held far from Harlem and far from any place that carried history. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just men who had run out of options and were tired of pretending otherwise. For years, pressure had been applied from every direction, and every time it met the same immovable presence. Violence failed, bribes were ignored, political influence stalled, Bumpy Johnson remained. That was the problem. The five families did not reach decisions quickly. They preferred inevitability. But this time, inevitability had arrived. Harlem was costing them money, influence, and something more dangerous than either: precedent. As long as Bumpy lived, a black neighborhood in the heart of New York operated beyond their reach. That could not be allowed to stand. Street war was discussed and dismissed. Too loud, too unpredictable. Blood in Harlem would invite attention, disrupt business elsewhere, and harden resistance. They didn't want chaos, they wanted removal. That narrowed the field. Someone finally said what everyone was already thinking. You don't fight a man like Bumpy from the outside. You go through him. Loyalty had protected him for years. That same loyalty could be turned into a weapon. Betrayal was cheaper than war. The price mattered. Too low, and no one would risk it. Too high, and the move would draw unnecessary attention. The number was chosen carefully. $50,000, enough to change a life, not enough to look reckless. A sum that suggested confidence, not desperation. Money became leverage because desperation creates openings. They understood that no man was unbreakable, only properly tested. Illness, family, debt, fear, everyone carried something heavy enough to tip the scale. The contract was approved quietly. No signatures, no paperwork. Just an understanding passed through trusted channels. This was not a hit meant to make noise. It was designed to look inevitable after the fact. An inside job, clean, efficient. Final. Someone close would be turned. That decision crossed a line even they recognized. Killing an enemy was business. Turning a brother corrupted something deeper. But necessity dulls hesitation. And once that line was crossed, there was no retreat. The moment the price was set, the war became personal. This wasn't about territory anymore. It was about proving that loyalty had limits, that even Bumpy Johnson could be reached if the pressure was applied correctly. The Mafia believed they were choosing the most controlled option available. What they failed to consider was how carefully Bumpy had built his world. Loyalty around him wasn't blind. It was earned, maintained, reinforced daily. Turning someone close would require more than money. It would require time, silence, and patience. Ironically, patience was something they believed they had mastered. The plan moved forward in fragments. Conversations that looked casual. Offers framed as solutions. No threats at first, just opportunity. The kind that presents itself as mercy rather than corruption. Behind it all sat the assumption that Bumpy would never see it coming. That loyalty, once purchased, stayed hidden until the moment it mattered. That assumption was the final mistake. because while the contract moved quietly through the underworld, something else was already happening. Bumpy Johnson had not survived by trusting silence. He had survived by reading it. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous decisions are the ones made without noise. Somewhere between approval and execution, before the plan reached its final form, the balance had already begun to shift. The 5 families believed they were ahead of the game. In reality, they were walking into one that had already been set. The decision that crossed the line felt irreversible to them. Once betrayal was chosen, there was no turning back. What they didn't yet understand was that the point of no return had not trapped Bumpy, it had trapped them. Because when loyalty becomes the target, every quiet move leaves a trail. And the man they were trying to eliminate had spent his life learning how to follow it. Bumpy Johnson did not react the way men expected. There was no tightening of security, no sudden disappearances, no public displays of suspicion. Instead, he watched. Quietly, carefully, the kind of watching that misses nothing because it is never rushed. He noticed the smallest shifts first, a pause where confidence once lived. Eyes that dropped too quickly, hands that lingered when they should have moved with certainty. These were not signs of guilt yet. They were signs of weight, of something heavy being carried in silence. Bumpy had learned long ago that loyalty doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, slowly. The cracks appear long before the break. Most men wait for proof. Bumpy waited for patterns. He didn't accuse because accusations force choices. And forcing choices too early closes doors that might reveal more later. Instead, he tested without confrontation. He asked familiar questions and listened not to the answers, but to how they were delivered. He altered routines slightly, just enough to see who adjusted and who stumbled. Fear reveals itself when it thinks it's hidden. Over weeks, the picture sharpened. Someone close was struggling. Not reckless, not sloppy, but torn. Torn men are dangerous because they hesitate. Hesitation, in a world built on decisiveness, stands out. Bumpy confirmed what he already suspected without ever naming it. The contract wasn't rumor. It was active. And the most unsettling part wasn't that someone had been turned. It was why. He understood desperation. He had lived it. He recognized the quiet math people do when they believe they have no good options left. Money, fear, obligation, none of it surprised him. What surprised others was what he did next. He didn't stop the hit. Any man with his reach could have ended it immediately. One phone call, one warning, one quiet removal. That would have solved the problem in the traditional way. Clean, final, expected. But Bumpy wasn't interested in solving a single problem. He was interested in ending a way of thinking. Stopping the hit would have protected him, but it would have left the system intact. Someone else would be tempted later. Another contract, another test of loyalty. The cycle would continue, so he allowed it to move forward. This was not recklessness, it was control at a higher level. By letting the plan breathe, he gained time. By gaining time, he gained clarity. And with clarity came options far more powerful than reaction. Survival became secondary to strategy. Bumpy understood that the most dangerous position for his enemies was not when he was cornered, but when he was calm. Calm meant calculation. Calculation meant foresight. And foresight meant that the outcome was already being shaped. The danger of knowing too much is that it tempts action. Bumpy resisted that temptation. Knowledge, used too early, loses its value. He held it the way a chess player holds a piece back, waiting for the board to arrange itself. He watched the man chosen for betrayal wrestle with himself, watched the confidence drain slowly, watched loyalty erode under pressure. There was no pleasure in it, only confirmation. Every day that passed made the moment ahead heavier, not just for the traitor, but for everyone involved. The closer the plan moved toward execution, the fewer exits remained. Bumpy let that weight build, because he knew that when the moment arrived, the truth would reveal itself in a way no accusation ever could. In front of witnesses. In real time. Without explanation. The Mafia believed they were patient. They believed they were setting the pace. What they didn't see was that the board had already been arranged against them. Bumpy Johnson sat still not because he was waiting for death, but because he was waiting for exposure. The assassination attempt was no longer a threat. It was a tool. And as the weeks passed, one thing became inevitable. When the trigger was finally pulled, it would not end a life. It would end a war. The room felt ordinary, which made it dangerous. Smoke drifted lazily beneath low lights, glasses clinked. Jazz slid through the air like it always did, smooth and forgiving. This was a place built on routine, where familiarity dulled instinct. People relaxed here. They believed they were safe. Bumpy Johnson sat exactly where he always did. Same chair, same posture, calm, unguarded, almost casual. To anyone watching, there was nothing remarkable about the moment. That was the point. Violence rarely announces itself. It hides behind comfort. The man chosen for the job stood where he belonged. Close enough to act without drawing attention, close enough that no one questioned his presence. This was not a stranger approaching from the shadows. This was trust moving quietly through the room. Music played on. Laughter floated from a nearby table. Somewhere, someone poured another drink. Time kept moving because no one yet knew it was about to stop. The gun felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. $50,000. Fear, obligation, a line already crossed. There was no backing away now, not without consequences worse than failure. The weapon came up smoothly. No rush, no panic. The motion was practiced, controlled, invisible to everyone except the few who sensed something wrong without understanding why. Bumpy's back was turned. That was the moment the plan was built around. The opening everyone believed would end it. The final step of a calculation made weeks earlier in quiet rooms far from Harlem. The trigger was pulled. Click. Not a bang, not chaos, not screaming or blood or motion, just a dry, hollow sound that landed heavier than any gunshot could have. The music died mid-note. Conversations froze halfway through sentences. The room didn't erupt. It collapsed inward. 300 people inhaled at once and forgot how to exhale. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood it. The gun hadn't failed by accident. Accidents don't sound like certainty. In that single second, truth moved faster than fear. The contract was exposed. The betrayal was visible. The plan had not only failed, it had been reversed. Silence swallowed the room because silence had become the loudest thing anyone had ever heard. Bumpy didn't jump. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for anything. He finished what he was doing first, slowly, deliberately, as if honoring the weight of the moment by refusing to rush it. Then he turned. His face showed no anger, no surprise, just recognition. the kind that says the answer was known long before the question was asked. Every eye followed him, not because he demanded attention, but because authority had shifted and everyone felt it happen. Power didn't announce itself with violence. It revealed itself through control. The man holding the gun felt smaller with every passing heartbeat, not because he was about to die, but because he had already been seen, fully, publicly, irrevocably. That was the real failure. Bumpy spoke calmly, his voice carrying without effort through the stillness. He didn't need volume. Silence had already done the work for him. The words were simple, measured, final. In that instant, the $50,000 contract lost all value. Money could not erase what had just been revealed. Fear could not undo it. Violence was no longer an option because the lesson had already landed. Everyone in the room understood the same thing at the same time. This was no longer about an assassination attempt. It was about a man who had allowed the danger to surface so it could be crushed without force. The clique had rewritten the rules, and nothing in Harlem would move the same way again. No one moved, not after the clique, not after the silence settled like dust over the room. Every instinct expected the next step to be violent, a signal, a nod. A shot fired in response. That was how things usually ended, but Bumpy Johnson didn't give the ending anyone was waiting for. The man with the gun stood exposed, frozen between two worlds, alive, yet already erased. His hand trembled, not from fear of dying, but from the realization that death might have been easier. Bumpy looked at him for a long moment, not with rage, not with triumph, with clarity, the kind that strips excuses away and leaves only truth behind. Then Bumpy spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He explained. In front of everyone, he named what had happened without embellishment. A contract, a price, $50,000 offered to turn loyalty into a weapon. The room absorbed every word, not as gossip, but as instruction. This wasn't private justice. This was public definition. Bumpy made it clear that the man standing there had not failed because the gun misfired. He had failed the moment he accepted the money. The clique only revealed what had already been decided. Then came the mercy. Bumpy didn't order him killed. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't even step closer. He did something far more devastating. He let him live. The confusion rippled instantly. Death would have closed the story. Mercy forced it to continue. Bumpy told him he was free to walk out. No chase, no punishment waiting in the street. Just one condition. He could never return. Not to Harlem, not to the life he knew, not to the people he had stood beside. The man understood immediately. Survival wasn't a gift, it was a sentence. In their world, reputation was oxygen. Once stripped away, you didn't suffocate loudly. You faded, slowly, completely. By sparing him publicly, Bumpy ensured that every door would close behind him. No crew would trust him, no boss would believe him. The Mafia wouldn't protect him because he had failed. Harlem wouldn't forgive him because he had betrayed it. Money could move bodies. It couldn't rebuild honor. The man left the room alive, but finished. Everyone watching knew it. That was the lesson. Loyalty wasn't proven by words or years served. It was proven in the moment temptation arrived. Bumpy turned to the room, not to threaten, but to clarify. He reminded them that protection wasn't something he offered lightly. It was earned. And once earned, it was absolute. But betrayal erased everything that came before it. Not with bullets, but with truth. No one missed the meaning. Mercy, delivered this way, was not kindness. It was finality without blood. It allowed no martyrdom, no myth, no honorable ending, just a long, quiet disappearance into irrelevance. The Mafia's money had saved a life and had destroyed a future in the same breath. That was the brilliance of it. Violence creates fear, but fear fades. Shame lasts, exile lingers. Being alive without belonging was worse than death in a world built on reputation and memory. By the time the man reached the door, his name was already gone. Bumpy didn't watch him leave. He didn't need to. The message wasn't for the traitor anymore. It was for everyone else. Harlem understood that loyalty here couldn't be bought. The Mafia understood that turning insiders carried consequences they couldn't control. What had begun as a contract ended as a lesson that spread faster than any bullet ever could. And as the room slowly breathed again, one truth settled into the bones of everyone present. Bumpy Johnson didn't rule through fear of death. He ruled through the understanding that some fates were far worse. By morning, the story had moved faster than any messenger ever could. It traveled through kitchens and back rooms, across phones that never slept, into offices where men weighed risk like accountants. The contract hadn't failed. It had reversed itself. That distinction mattered. Meetings were called quietly. No grand gatherings, no shouting. Just smoke, silence, and men who understood that something fundamental had shifted. They replayed the night piece by piece, not for drama, but for consequence. The math was different now. Killing Bumpy Johnson no longer promised control. It promised questions, exposure, instability. A public reminder that someone inside could be turned, manipulated, and humiliated in front of witnesses. Violence, once the simplest answer, had become the most expensive. Some argued for retaliation out of pride. Pride was dismissed quickly. Pride didn't pay bail. Pride didn't calm neighborhoods. Pride didn't protect revenue streams that depended on quiet order. Harlem was not just territory. It was a system. Numbers, businesses, families, politics. Bumpy sat at the center like a stabilizing weight. Removing him violently now would crack everything at once. Riots were possible. Police attention was guaranteed. Alliances would fracture. And worse, the message would be wrong. Killing him after that night wouldn't restore authority. It would confirm his lesson. It would tell every operator watching that patience beat force, that loyalty couldn't be bought cheaply, and that power didn't always belong to the loudest gun. The price had been $50,000. The cost had become immeasurable. Strategists spoke last. They always did. They asked the questions nobody wanted to answer. What happens the day after he's gone? Who fills the vacuum? Who keeps Harlem from turning hostile? Who absorbs the fallout? No one had answers. That silence was decisive. The conclusion formed without a vote. Harlem would be left alone, not as surrender, as adjustment. Resources would be redirected. Other boroughs offered cleaner returns with fewer variables. Brooklyn, Queens, places where control didn't come with symbols and stories attached. Harlem was different. Harlem had memory. Orders moved quietly after that. Pressure eased. Lines were redrawn without announcement. No one admitted retreat. They simply stopped advancing. Bumpy Johnson didn't hear about the decision immediately. He didn't need to. He felt it in the absence of movement, in the lack of response that followed what should have been escalation. In their world, silence was confirmation. What stunned observers wasn't that the Mafia stepped back. It was why. Not because they were afraid of him, because they respected the terrain he had shaped, because continuing the fight meant playing by rules he had written. One man had reset boundaries without firing a shot. Harlem became untouchable not through threat, but through logic. The kind that survives pride and outlasts grudges. The kind that changes maps without ink. Years later, veterans would still mention that decision quietly, the night when money lost its leverage. When strategy overruled revenge, because $50,000 could buy a trigger pull. It couldn't buy the future. That understanding spread quietly through circles that never wrote things down. Younger men learned it as caution, older men as confirmation. The balance had shifted, and everyone adjusted their steps accordingly, careful not to disturb what had proven itself unmovable. It wasn't spoken of as mercy or mercy denied. It was remembered as the night calculation defeated chaos, and why sometimes the smartest move is letting the moment reveal who truly controls it. After that, no one mistook restraint for weakness again, and no one confused money with power in Harlem. The city kept breathing, quieter, steadier, shaped by a lesson that would not fade. It lingered long after deals ended and names disappeared. That was the real cost they counted, in silence afterward, always. Money has a way of fading. It changes hands, loses value, gets replaced by the next number that sounds bigger. What doesn't fade are moments that redefine how power works. Years after the night the trigger clicked, the $50,000 contract became a story people told quietly, not because of the amount, but because of how little it ultimately mattered. Bumpy Johnson lived on. Not recklessly, not loudly. He continued the way he always had, steady and deliberate, a presence that didn't need to announce itself. Harlem adjusted around him, calmer in ways outsiders never fully understood. Pressure came and went, but it never crossed the same line again. When Bumpy died years later, it wasn't by a gun. There was no ambush, no headline splashed with blood. It was a heart attack, sudden, ordinary, in the same neighborhood that had once held its breath for him, in the same places where he had sat quietly while others panicked. That ending mattered. In a world where most legends burn out violently, his didn't. There was no final showdown, no dramatic fall. Just a man who lived long enough to see his lesson take root, and died knowing it would outlast him. Harlem remembered him not as the man who survived an assassination, but as the man who turned it inside out. The night money failed became shorthand for something deeper. A reminder that wealth could open doors, but it couldn't force outcomes when intelligence was already ahead of the game. People spoke about that night in fragments, about the silence, about the calm, about how authority shifted without anyone raising their voice. Each retelling stripped away exaggeration until only the truth remained. Power, real power, had nothing to do with the trigger. It had everything to do with knowing when it would be pulled. That understanding spread beyond Harlem. Men who had never met Bumpy Johnson adjusted how they moved, how they tested loyalty, how they weighed patience against impulse. Some learned the lesson directly. Others learned it by watching what didn't happen afterward. No invasion. No retaliation, no revenge tour, just restraint. And restraint, when chosen deliberately, carries a weight violence never can. Violence forces attention. Restraint commands it. The rule everyone remembered was simple. You could buy action. You couldn't buy foresight. You could hire someone to pull a trigger. You couldn't hire someone to see 10 moves ahead unless they already lived that way. That was the difference. Bumpy's legacy wasn't built on how many men he outgunned, but on how many fights he never had to finish. On how often he let others expose themselves while he stayed still. In time, even the Mafia stopped telling the story as a warning about him. They told it as a reminder to themselves. A quiet acknowledgement that some battles aren't worth the cost, no matter how much money is on the table. Harlem kept that memory close. It became part of the neighborhood's language, part of how elders explained respect to younger men who believed power was loud and immediate. They pointed to that night and said, "That's what control looks like. Not chaos, not fear, control." The $50,000 was spent long ago. The men who authorized it are gone, but the outcome remains untouched. A war ended before it could begin. Boundaries redrawn without blood, a reputation that didn't need defending because it had already been proven. In the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't defeat his enemies by destroying them. He defeated them by letting them show their limits. That is the kind of power money can never buy. And that is why, long after the sound of that click faded, its echo still mattered.